Hey, Happy New Year. Welcome to Hughes Performance Tech Talk. We appreciate you tuning in. With the new year, we thought we'd start a whole new episode on Powerglide transmissions. So be sure to hit that subscribe button and like and share our videos. You want to receive the latest updates because this is going to be an ongoing series where we break down the Powerglide transmission and some of its components to explain the inner workings, dispel some myths, and help you understand the transmission better. So in this first episode, we're going to talk about the Powerglide input shaft because that's been a subject of question for a lot of years. You'll hear a lot of information out there about Powerglide input shafts regarding terminology like turbo spline or turbo shaft or Powerglide spline, and a lot of it can be confusing, especially if you're just getting into drag racing or street strip cars where you might be considering a Powerglide transmission for your vehicle. So the aluminum case Powerglide that's popular in drag racing circles and street strip cars began production by General Motors in 1962. It ran about 10 years in production. There were literally millions of them produced. They were used in passenger cars behind anything from a 230 cubic inch inline six-cylinder engine all the way up to a 375 horse 396 big block Chevy engine. So they ran the gamut as far as how GM used them and what platforms you could find them in. There were only two different lengths originally. There was a long Powerglide, which used this long output shaft, and then there was a little bit shorter one that was common to like an Impala or a Biscayne that had a coarser spline. We're going to talk about that more in detail in episode 2 when we cover output shafts. But input shafts is going to be the main focus here. So GM produced the Powerglide with two different gear sets in the transmission. They had a 176 ratio in low gear and they had a 182 ratio in low gear. And because of how those gear sets were designed, there's actually two different length input shafts that were produced by GM. So in the input shaft sampling here, this is an original GM input shaft that came out of a Powerglide with a 182 gear set. It measures 12 5/8 of an inch overall length from tip to tip. And as you can see, it's got a coarse 17 spline for the turbine and the converter. And this spline is common to all Powerglide transmissions. So regardless of the length of the tranny or the production year of the tranny, 62 or later, or the gear set that was in the transmission, all your OEM shafts are going to have this coarse 17 spline input. Next in line, we have an OEM input shaft out of a Powerglide with a 176 planetary. This is a little bit longer at 12 7/8 of an inch. And as I just mentioned, still the common coarse 17 spline for the turbine and the converter. You can't mix these two shafts when you're dealing with OEM parts because of the length difference. If you go and put a 176 style input shaft in a 182 transmission, the converter actually isn't going to fully seat into the pump, and you're going to have converter end play problems. And if you just go and bolt stuff together, you could actually wipe out the front pump in the transmission as well as your engine thrust bearings. So definitely want to avoid mixing and matching when you're dealing with OEM parts. That being said, you won't see an OEM input shaft typically used these days unless it's just a nuts and bolts restoration where they're keeping absolutely everything original, or in a lot of circle track racing where you have entry-level classes like a factory stock class where you're running perhaps a low gear only or high gear only Powerglide. You don't have a tremendous amount of stress on the shaft, you'll see stock shaft used in there. So unless you're dealing with one of those scenarios, chances are you're going to have to worry about this too much. The reason you aren't going to have to worry about this too much is because the aftermarket addressed this length disparity by creating what's commonly referred to in the aftermarket as a combo shaft. So I've got a couple examples of those here in our entry-level aftermarket input shafts for the Powerglide. Now the combo shaft basically just splits the difference between these two lengths. So they'll typically check at about 12 3/4 of an inch overall length. And that's enough wiggle room to where you can successfully use the combo shaft in either style of planetary and not run into a height issue as far as creating any interference with your converter fitment. So this shaft here is a combo shaft. It's made out of 4340 steel, so it's quite a bit stronger than the OEM material. You can see it still shares the OEM style core spline, so this shaft can actually be used with a stock Powerglide converter or any aftermarket Powerglide converter that still features a stock turbine spline. This is a pretty decent shaft as far as shafts go. We generally don't like to throw more than about 750 flywheel horsepower at this shaft. Again, it'll fit either 176 or 182 style carriers. I want to segue because it's important to note that obviously if you're getting into Powerglides, you'll notice there's a lot more ratios out there than 176 and 182. And that can be another area of confusion as far as, well, what input shaft do I use? Because you might be using a 180 gear set or a 198 gear set or 169, 158, so on and so forth. So all of those aftermarket ratios for the most part are based on a 176 style of planetary carrier. So you're either going to use the longer 176 style input shaft or the combo shaft with any of those aftermarket ratios that have a 176 style carrier. Anything that has a 182 style carrier, which there are some aftermarket gear sets out there that use that carrier, are going to need to use either the shorter shaft or, again, you can get away with the combo shaft. Different manufacturers have different ways of going about what lengths they manufacture to. There are some manufacturers that still follow the short and long rule based on OEM lengths and don't offer a combo shaft. So if you're getting into a build where you're doing it yourself or you're dealing with a local builder who sources parts from multiple suppliers, you just want to make sure that you have your I's dotted and your T's crossed so that you're using an appropriate shaft with an appropriate planetary carrier. So having gotten that out of the way, we'll keep going through this input shaft arrangement here. This next one in line, this is also a combo shaft, so it splits the difference like we talked about. And this is the same 4340 material as our aftermarket 17 spline shaft. So again, a good power range is about 750 at the flywheel. You can throw a little more at it. It really just depends on how much torque the engine makes, the coefficient of friction available as far as your racing surface goes, how heavy the car is, and what your rear axle ratio is. So all that's going to affect what shaft is right for you. What sets this one apart is that you see it has a finer spline on it. This is what's called a turbo shaft. If you hear people say a Powerglide turbo shaft or Powerglide turbo spline shaft, this is what they're talking about. So this is a 30 spline input that's common to the TH350 and the TH400. This gives you a stronger connection between the shaft and the converter. It's physically larger diameter and has greater spline count for increased surface area. And it also allows you to use a 350 or a 400 style torque converter in your Powerglide. Now, there's another trick that can trip you up if you're not aware of it when it comes to putting a turbo spline input shaft into a Powerglide transmission. 350 and 400 torque converters, as far as OEM goes, and a lot of entry-level aftermarket converters, don't have a support bushing inside the converter for the turbine. The turbine is the piece that rides on the input shaft here inside the converter. Because they don't have that, if you just slide the shaft into a normal Powerglide pump and put a 350 or 400 converter in there that doesn't have a turbine bushing, the shaft's going to be able to flop around because it has no support here at the turbine side of the shaft inside the converter. In that scenario, you need to machine the front of the stator tube in the Powerglide front pump and press a bushing in there that will provide support for the shaft here and in turn provide support for the turbine in the converter, which is splined to this piece of the shaft. Now, when you buy this particular shaft from Hughes Performance, we actually supply this shaft with that bushing, so you're covered no matter what. If you're doing your own build or you're unsure of what bushing to use and you're stuck, the bushing actually comes from a Turbo 400 stator or a Sun shaft. That's all the same bushing, and that's the bushing you want to use to support this journal area on the input shaft when you're using a 350 or 400 converter with no turbine support bushing. That being said, A lot of aftermarket 350 and 400 converters these days do have the turbine support bushing in them, so you want to make sure that you contact the manufacturer of whoever made the converter and ask them, hey, does this have a turbine support bushing in it? That way you know whether or not you need the bushing in the stator tube or you don't. In all of our Pro Series converters, our Sportsman Series converters, and our Pro SSX converters, we automatically include the turbine support bushing, whether it's turbo spline or Powerglide spline. We just like to cover all the bases so that way you never have an issue. If you're dealing with one of our street converters, generally speaking, they don't have the bushing. However, if you don't want to have to machine the stator tube and install that bushing, you can simply ask us to put a turbine bushing in your street converter and we'll do it for you. It's no problem whatsoever. And that'll save you some machining and some hassle if you're doing a build yourself. So moving into the higher horsepower options, we have this shaft. And again, it's combo length, so it splits the difference, and that's true of all of our input shafts for Hughes Performance. Again, not necessarily true for every manufacturer, but it is for us. This is also a turbo shaft. You can see it's got the finer spline for the converter turbine, GM30 spline, uses 350 or 400 converter. And it keeps the conventional sealing ring location so that you have proper cooler oil management and lubrication oil management to the gear train according to the original GM circuitry through the pump stator. This is a slide-in, drop-in replacement, doesn't require any special machining. This is manufactured out of a billet of H11 tool steel. It's really tough stuff. Has a lot of twist resistance, very high tensile strength. We generally rate this shaft up to about 1,500 flywheel horsepower. And again, that's a nominal rating like all of our shafts because, as we discussed earlier, your engine torque, your gear ratios, your tire size, traction that's available, vehicle weight, how you're using it, that all affects how much power the shaft can actually safely handle before you reach the fatigue point and the shaft fails. So you don't necessarily always want to just be purchasing products, whether it's from us or anybody else, based on advertised power ratings. It's worth your time to send an email or make a phone call, ask a technical support representative about your combination. We'll help guide you through the process to make sure you get the right parts the first time. You don't make any assumptions that are going to cost you money with broken parts later down the road. Moving down the line, astute viewers may notice a difference right away in this shaft compared to the other shafts we've been looking at, and that difference is you have no sealing rings in this bushing journal area. So combo length, 30 spline, 350, 400 style turbo shaft. Dimensionally, it's a slide-in replacement for any of these shafts. However, you don't want to go and do that because this is what's called a ringless shaft. So this requires a unique stator tube in your front pump in order to maintain proper cooler flow and lube oil through the hole here, out the hole here, and out the hole here for your gear train lube. If you just run a ringless shaft in a standard Powerglide pump that's set up for a ring style shaft, the transmission will still work, the converter will still work, the converter is going to act looser in terms of stall speed, and it's going to overheat because you're not routing cooler oil properly through the hydraulic circuitry in the transmission. So there are some builders who will press in a modified stator tube into a stock stator body that has bushings here to support this ringless shaft and give you that proper oil control. There are also a wide variety of aftermarket pumps that use a billet bolt-in stator tube that already have the bushings in them, again to give you that proper oil control. We offer both options here at Hughes, although our default is a billet pump with a billet steel bolt-in stator tube that has the bushings already in it, and we like to sell that as a matched combination whenever possible. There are different locations on this oiling hole depending on who manufactures the shaft. So if you already have a ringless shaft transmission and you want to put one of our shafts in it, you just want to make sure that you're comparing oil hole locations so you get proper alignment between the bushings and the stator tube and you're not blocking this off. Generally speaking, our shaft will fit a pretty wide variety of ringless pumps, but it's always a good idea to double check it. It's also a good idea to double check the outside diameter of this bushing land and compare it to your old shaft to make sure you aren't pulling out a shaft with a different dimension. If it's bigger or looser, that's going to cause its own set of problems. Generally speaking, we rate this shaft to right around 2,000 flywheel horsepower. We've had customers use it with more, with success. So it is possible to throw more power at this shaft. Again, consult one of our technical representatives to help you pick the right shaft for your combination. This next one in line looks very, very similar to the shaft we just talked about. It's also a ringless shaft, also combo length, also turbo spline. It's simply a different material. This is made out of Aramet 100 steel versus H11 steel, like these two shafts here. Aramet 100 is basically the strongest steel that we currently have available to produce a shaft from. And what you're looking at here is the strongest ringless turbo spline Powerglide input shaft available in the industry. We rate this shaft for 2,500 horsepower. We've had guys throw more at it. Again, you just need to make that phone call. You need to get a tech consultation to find out which shaft is right for you. If you want to upgrade from an existing shaft like our H11 shaft, or like a NASA or a Vasco shaft that's real popular out there, this shaft is generally a direct replacement for any of those shafts. Again, just double check your oiling hole location and your bushing journal dimension to make sure you have an exact match. So what about the guys that have more than 2,500 horsepower? What do you do in that circumstance to prevent premature input shaft failure? That's where XP4 Promod Powerglide comes in, and that transmission features this input shaft here, and you can see there's quite an appreciable difference there in the overall outside diameter as well as the spline dimension of the input shaft, not only on the turbine side but also on the planetary side of the input shaft. So like this shaft, we also manufacture this out of Aramet 100 billet steel. Super strong to begin with. It's got 1.25 inch, 29 spline turbine side. So if you're replacing, say, like a Bruno or a Lenco drive, this was a common dimension that was used. Your Bruno or Lenco drive converter will actually fit our Powerglide with this shaft without any changes. So that makes life easy. We neck down to 1 3/16", 27 spline dimension on the planetary side of the shaft. That's because that's really about the biggest practical diameter you can physically fit in the Powerglide and still maintain proper gear design. This obviously isn't a drop-in. It requires a unique front pump, unique clutch hub, unique direct drum, unique planetary gear set. So we sell all those components if you want to convert your own transmission, and of course we have complete XP4 assemblies available for purchase. As far as power rating goes, honestly, we don't necessarily know the limitations of this shaft or that transmission. We rate them for 4,000 at the flywheel, but we haven't had somebody actually break one of these shafts from power yet. So pretty durable stuff. The transmission's overall outside dimensions are identical to other Powerglides, so it fits right in place if you're already running a Powerglide in your program and you want the ultimate. The XP4 will bolt right in place with the corresponding matching converter. Finally, we have this shaft, and again, you might notice a difference. You can see it looks the same as our XP4, but it's got this funny looking tip here. Well, this is our XP5 shaft. That's our lockup Powerglide transmission. So this shaft allows you to use a lockup torque converter. That's what this pilot with this sealing ring is here for. This actually seals into the clutch housing in the converter, and fluid is routed through the gun drilled shaft through this tip to apply the lockup clutch assembly inside the torque converter. So this shaft in our XP5, very similar to XP4, 1.25 inch, 29 spline turbine side, 1 3/16", 27 spline planetary side. Because this is a lockup style shaft, it does require a unique style front pump, as well as lockup circuitry and solenoid to be added to the valve body. So it's not a direct interchange with our XP4 stuff, but an XP4 can be converted to an XP5 pretty easily. Again, this is Aramet 100 steel. It's basically bulletproof. We don't know the power limitations of it because, again, even with our lockup, we haven't had somebody break a shaft from horsepower yet. So That pretty much covers Powerglide input shafts. If you have any questions, observations, or thoughts, definitely post them in the comments below. We'll be on there interacting with your questions and your comments. We're happy to answer any questions you have. You can also hit us up on Facebook or Instagram, our website, hughesperformance.com. Feel free to call us at 1-800-274-RACE. That's RACE. We really appreciate you tuning in. Be sure to subscribe so you catch the next episode. And we also have a really killer converter series on our channel. So if you're curious about torque converter function, you can go back and watch that 7-part series as well. Thank you.